There, we're starting a new video series on 1 Corinthians chapter 13, one of the most famous chapters, and the chapter really deals with the whole concept of love. And what we want to do is sort of unpack this idea. The reason for that is because, to be honest, I think this is a season when talking about love is very important. We need to think about love for others. As Christians, we need to think about love for people who are our fellow Christians, regardless of their race or their ethnic background, or even their class, or all the things that could potentially divide us. We want to love in specific and tangible ways. And then secondly, it's just important because in a season like this where there's so much polarization, Christ calls us to love our enemies. And so what we want to do is take the idea of love and unpack it from this chapter. And so that's what we're going to do. One of the first things you notice about the chapter of chapter 13 of 1 Corinthians is that it's full of descriptions about love, what love does. It's full of descriptions about how love functions, how love informs, but it never deals with what love actually is. There's no definition of love. One theologian said love resists definition in the New Testament. What he's talking about there is he's just saying people know what love is. We can find ways to sort of manufacture new definitions of love, but when push really comes to shove, we all know what it means to love somebody. When you love someone else, you have heart affection for them, and that is a mental affection. You care for them with your mind. It's an emotional, an affectional reality, and it's also a willful thing. It acts, it moves us to do certain things. And what Paul describes in 1 Corinthians 13 is some components of all three of those things. And so as we just unpack this idea of love over the next few videos, what we want to do is just look at how those things functionally take place in the heart of a true Christian. So just jump in right away into verse 1. And Paul says in verse 1, he says, "If I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I've become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal." Now, the whole idea of tongues here is important because what Paul's just finished talking about is miraculous spiritual gifts, where in chapter 12, Paul describes revelatory works of the Holy Spirit of God, where he, during this early church season, was able to communicate new truth, new revelation through prophets and those who spoke in tongues. Now, we as a church believe that those things have ceased, that there's no longer any new revelation through the Holy Spirit, through tongues or other means, because, to be honest, they're not necessary. We have the New Testament, and that's complete. And that is exactly what Paul says at the end of chapter 13 here. However, what Paul says is so important because he says, even if I do speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but if I don't have love, I'm like a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. What he's saying when he says with the tongues of men and of angels, he's not saying that there are specific angelic tongues that he's necessarily referencing. And he's not talking about all the physical tongues on earth necessarily either. What he's saying is, if I speak with every possible language, if I have all ministry abilities, all teaching abilities, all expressed spiritual insights, all the ability to communicate what God would have to say, and I can say all things that are true, and I can do it not only to men but to angels. I'm able to talk in every level to every spiritual being in the universe. If I do all of that talking in all of those languages without love, what does he say? He says, ultimately, those things are empty. And he compares them to a clanging gong, or a noisy gong, or a clanging cymbal. Now, what's he saying? He's saying if you take love out of words, what do they become? They become obnoxious and noisy. Words are very painful when they're not communicated in love. And even when truth is communicated, when it's not communicated in love, as Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4, speaking the truth in love, what happens is our words become hurtful. They're hurtful because they're not communicated with a heart of love. We all know how this feels, right? We all know what it feels like to have someone tell us something that maybe is true, but when it's come to us from a heart of lovelessness, it's extremely painful. It hurts us to hear those things. And so what Paul is saying here is that it's good for us to communicate truth, but that truth must come first from a heart of love, a heart of affection for that person. The annoying pain to the ears of a clanging metal is the sound that Paul's describing here. You know this sound. You just take a metal spoon and you beat onto a pot, or you bang two pots together super loud. It's very painful, very uncomfortable. To your ears, it doesn't sound good. My family and I just got back from a road trip, and I can tell you that when you put 6 kids in the back of a car and you drive for 15 and a half hours straight, pretty quickly, you're sick and tired of noise. It's not even their fault. They're just trying to be kids in the back seat, but that noise can be incredibly difficult to deal with over an extended period of time. And Paul is saying speaking without love is the same as that feeling of annoying, loud, clanging, noisy, painful communication. And so what he says is this. He says, listen, if you're going to speak with love. That's really what Paul is saying. And if you don't have love, then ultimately everything that you say is just painful and noisy. Now, when Paul talks about love, we need to be very careful here as Christians. Sometimes Christians say, well, love is the truth. I'm going to love you with the truth. I'm going to tell you the truth, and therefore I'm going to love you. Paul isn't talking about truth here. It's important. He's just finished talking about new revelation from the Spirit of God. And he says, even if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, even if I could communicate all that truth, if I don't do it with love, I'm like a noisy gong. So what is he saying? He's saying just speaking the truth isn't enough. And that should tell us that should connect very clearly in our minds with Ephesians chapter 4, where Paul says, speaking the truth in love. Yeah, it's very important. When we say, well, I'm going to speak the truth, but I don't necessarily need to love that person because I'm speaking the truth, and by speaking the truth, I'm loving them. That's not what Paul is saying. Paul doesn't say, speak the truth, which is love. He says, speak the truth in love. And so he's not just talking about truth. Second, he's not talking about the tone of your voice. He's not talking about how you communicate, right? He's not saying if you use a nice voice and you talk in a soft voice, then that will be equivalent to love. No, we can talk in a soft voice and still be angry and sinful in our hearts. We can not like a person and talk in a soft voice. That's not love. When Paul says, if I speak with the tongues of men and angels, but I do not have love, what he's saying is an issue that's internal, not an external mode of communication. We can be very good actors and act like we love somebody and have a soft tone, but not actually love them. Next, he's not talking about fakery, right? Smiling on the outside. Faking it till we make it, as it's sometimes said, right? Smile, be kind, all these things on the external. What is that? That's just hypocrisy when our hearts aren't truly loving a person. And finally, what's he not talking about? He's not talking about selfishly motivated kindness, right? He's not talking about the motives of the heart being selfish. So I'm going to act like I love this person because if I love them, then they'll hear and that'll help them. But I don't actually care for them. I'm not actually affectionately caring for them. Paul would say, no, that's just another form of hypocrisy. And he's not talking about just using words of love. You can say, I love you, and not actually mean that, right? I mean, we know this. You can tell someone things, and you can even express love, but not actually love them. And we all know that that's not true, right? We all feel when those things are being said to us, and they're not actually accurate, when we don't actually love the person. And so none of those things are what Paul's talking about. What's he talking about? He's talking about an internal heart affection for the person. Now, what's fascinating about this is, he says, if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, but I don't have love, I'm like a noisy gong or clanging cymbal. If you take the opposite of that, you invert that sentence, what does it say? It says, if I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and I have love, then I'm pleasant to the ear. What's he saying? He's saying truth communicated from a heart of love is pleasant to hear. Now, it's not always comfortable when someone tells us the truth. Sometimes people tell us the truth and be very painful to us. Many times in my life, people have come and rebuked me and corrected me for various types of sins, and it can be extremely painful to hear those things. But what Paul is saying is, when we love a person, truth communicated ultimately results in pleasantness, because the love in our hearts for that person seasons what we say. It makes it pleasant. We are kind to them, genuinely kind. We genuinely care for their well-being. So ultimately, what's the conclusion to this verse? What he's saying is this. He's saying truth is good, but truth must come from a heart of affection. If it doesn't come from a heart of affection, it's better to not speak than it is to speak without love. Well, I hope that's encouraging to you. Keep walking through. Thanks.